but has evolved both in terms of parameters, in terms of some of the details of the sectors, but the structure is basically the same as it was in 1992. And the structure of the model is shown in the figure here. I'll just describe it briefly. You have economic growth leading to emissions on the upper left, and that's from our driving, our heating, our cooking, our airplane, our air travel. This leads to rising CO2 concentrations and other forces leading to climate change, and climate change is not just temperature, but it's precipitation, sea level rise, and many other processes. And then the next arrow, it has impacts, ecological impacts, economic impacts, lower corn yields, coastal flooding, ocean acidification, which is actually the other carbon dioxide problem, which I won't talk about very much, but it's bad for crustaceans. And then the next link is climate change policies to reduce emissions, and these would be through different mechanisms such as cap and trade, which you know here in Europe, carbon taxes, which you know in Sweden, regulations, which all countries know, and then that through the policies leads back up to affecting emissions, reducing emissions, and then affecting more, in a greater or lesser degree, climate, economic growth itself. And I put those arrows there and the first two arrows are ones we know about and actually exist. The other two, those don't actually exist in all cases. So this is the circular flow that is part of the modeling that we're talking about today. So I want to say a word. Let's see what we're doing here. I was saying a word about mathematics for just a little bit about mathematics as a language, particularly for people, for young people and students, and who are thinking about what they're going to study. My first teacher and mentor and co-author, Paul Samuelson, was also the first American laureate in economics. And he was responsible for the introduction of mathematics into economics. And his view was mathematics is necessary if we were to understand and analyze complex phenomena. And it's interesting, that point is now part of my brain. It's actually built in just as much as the English language is part of my brain. And it's interesting, the great American physicist, John Willard Gibbs, in a Yale faculty meeting, when there was a debate about foreign languages, he stood up and he said, "Mathematics is language," and he sat down. And he's right. The language, and that language is increasingly part of our lives. It's from the design of the computers that are running the show here, to our power plants, to the medical scans that save our lives. I think mathematics is our future. So I think we need to study foreign languages. We need to study all kinds of things, poetry, art, but mathematics is key to so many areas of our future. The language of mathematics is also central to our modeling of climate change economics. I'll just show you a little picture here. I thought I'd show you the mathematics of the model, and here it is. That's all it is. It's a constrained maximization problem. It's kind of simple, so there's a lot of vectors here and times and integrals and so on, and it'll be discretized for the actual computerized model. But any of you who know the modeling and know mathematical economics will say, oh yeah, that's a simple old growth model that we know and love for so many years ago. And those of you who know mathematics will say, well, that's kind of interesting. And those of you who don't, just view it as it's a counterpoint of Goya. It's just a picture here. Maybe not so frightening. I don't know. Maybe more frightening. But don't be frightened. Don't be frightened. Economists have focused on the strategy. So let me just turn now to a little bit of the actual results. So economists have focused on economists and others have focused on strategies to slow climate change, and there are basically three potential strategies. Abatement or reduction of emissions is the one I'll focus on. A second one is removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which would be wonderful, but actually you could grow trees to do that, for example, well, I won't say but. And then there's management of solar radiation through, say, putting dust in the stratosphere. Abatement, the first one I mentioned, is the only realistic and safe option at present. Others may come along, but at present it's all that we have. So I'm going to concentrate there. But I have to say, while realistic, it's also expensive, particularly in if we are ambitious. And just to give an example, a common goal of the international, say, negotiations and policies is to limit temperature to 2 degrees C above sort of pre-industrial levels. And estimates are that that might cost about 4% of our income over the next century or two. This may be good for nature, but it's not actually all that attractive to voters to reduce their income that sharply. So it shows some of the trade-off. Now, that's abatement. I'll say just a word about damages, because in our economics, what we're going to do is weigh the costs of reducing emissions and slowing climate change or limiting temperature on the one hand with the reduction in damages on the other. So you have to go out and do the modeling. You have to determine what the damages are. And you might say, well, that's impacts easier because abatement, you need the physics and the chemistry and all that. But actually, damages is just economics and ecology. But actually, damages are much, much more difficult. And it's probably the most difficult task in all of our processes that were on that last slide, because it's so far in the future. There are things we don't understand very well. We don't have historical experience of this, so it's actually probably the most difficult. So what I'll do is I'll show you some illustrative results. I suppose these slides will be available, so they will be available? Will they be? I guess they will be available on the website, so some of you who, I know this goes by very fast, but some of you who want to look at them in detail can go back and find them. But I want to show you an example of the results from the DICE model. And this, I want to emphasize, this is only one of many models. There are people in the room who do, I won't point you out, but you know who you are, who are doing other models, and they're wonderful models. There are people around the world who are doing this. The only reason I present, well, the main reason I present it is because I know it, but also it's a simple model, has the virtue of simplicity and comprehensiveness in the sense that it does close all the boxes, the links in that, and other models, some do and some don't. But I would emphasize that these are very simplified models. And so, for example, the climate sector, 2 equations, whereas if you go to some of the large climate models, they'll have 1 million equations. And so these are these don't have the resolution of the most most comprehensive and up-to-date models. So let me do, excuse me. So I want to talk about 4 sets of policies, and I'll just mention these briefly. One is what a business as usual, which is basically no policies or minimal policies. A second one is where you balance the costs and the benefits. A third is where you limit temperatures over time to, say, 1.5 degrees, which is the latest objective, or 2 degrees or 2.5 degrees. And a third is my modification of that, where you don't limit it as an absolute cap, but you limit it over an average period. The idea being that actually makes more sense because a lot of processes are a function of averages rather than just the absolute level at a point of time. So those are the 4 that I'll show you some results from. So one is you take these, and just one other thing. So you take this business as usual, what happened, and then let's say if you want to limit the temperature to 2 degrees C, which is in the 3rd bullet there, how can you do that most efficiently? So it's not just any old way, but you've got costs of doing it, and you've got the systems, and you want to find how can I limit it to 2 degrees in the way that's the most, the least costly in the economic sense. So here's a picture that shows. It's a little crowded, but I'll give you a quick rundown. So the top, this is time from 0 to, I've gone to 2150 just to give it a little further depth, and this is then from 0 to 6 degrees C above pre-industrial. We're already at about 0.8 or 0.9. And then this shows you different paths doing this. And the top path is if we do nothing, and you can see that just keeps climbing, and it's pretty substantial by the 2100 or 2150. And then there are other paths. There's one that have, say, economic cost-benefit path where you balance costs and benefits. And then there's this green one where you limit it to 2 degrees C. And then some of the other ones are where you limit it, say, 2 degrees C with a 200-year averaging, 2 degrees C with a 100-year averaging, or 1.5 degrees with a 100-year averaging. They all look pretty much this. So if you go out they actually don't look very different for quite a while, and then they begin to diverge after 2050 or so. But they'll have very different paths. But the main thing I want to show you is actually, if you take steps now to implement these, you have quite different futures from very, very high temperatures on the one hand to relatively low for the temperature limiting paths. On the next slide, I want to show you, it shows you the economics of this. So the green line, the green bars show you, and don't worry too much about the units here on the left. They're present values, but they're just, the bars are what I want to emphasize on. So you can see the damages from doing nothing to the optimal to the temperature limiting, and the damages obviously, as you limit temperature increase, the damages are going to go down from left to right. And these are increasingly stringent policies from left to right, increasingly ambitious policies. And then, so the damages go down, but then what are the costs? Well, they're not much cost if you don't do anything, but as you become increasingly ambitious, the costs rise. So you want to, what the economics says, well, how are you going to balance these? And if you're, and you can see that the extremes, you have a lot of damages and no cost at one extreme and a lot of costs and very low damages at the other, and somehow in between you can balance the two. And what you want to think of in economics, or in more generally, is what's the best balance between these two? Is it the optimal? Is it a 2 degree? Is it an averaging period? What different averaging period? So you want to find some balance between the costs and the costs and the damages. Now, economics, let's see where I am now. Yep. So economics points to one inconvenient truth about climate change policy, and that is, to be effective, the policies have to raise the price of carbon or CO2. And by doing that, correct the externality of the marketplace. So I think one of the insights of economics that I feel very strongly about is that if you're going to be effective, you have to raise the price, because putting a price on our activities is the only way. I mean, we have to get billions of people in now and in the future, millions of firms, thousands of governments to take steps if we're going to move in the direction we want. And the only way that you're going to do that effectively is to increase the price of carbon. And I would say something about the history of that, because I think it's an interesting scientific story. The idea on carbon pricing flowed from the research on what are known technically as dual variables in linear programming, from the pioneering work of Kantorovich and Koopmans, for which they won the Nobel Prize in 1975. And it's, if you do that optimization I showed you a little earlier, and you just grind through it, and you look at what used to be computer printouts, we don't have those anymore, you would see the dual variables there. And I remember when I looked at it, I just scratched my head. I had no idea what this dual variable on the carbon constraint was. And there were different ones on different reservoirs. And then eventually I realized, and I'll quote from when I first realized, this is what I wrote in 1977, and I haven't gone much further than this. Because of the externalities, there are no market or political mechanisms which ensure that the appropriate level of control will be chosen. To implement the efficient path implies that we are implicitly putting a positive price on emissions of carbon into the atmosphere, quote, carbon taxes, as a way of implementing the global policy on a decentralized level. So that that was the first time it really occurred to me that to think of this in this way, and so it basically it is evolved over time, and I won't spend much more time on that. I'll just mention that this actually disappeared for a long time and then reemerged about 20 years later in the idea of the social cost of carbon, which is how much it costs to put a ton of carbon in the atmosphere. And that's actually central now to national policies. It's central to the design of climate institutions as setting a carbon price or carbon tax. So over the years, nations have negotiated many international climate treaties, the Framework Convention, the Kyoto Protocol, the Copenhagen Accord, the Paris Accord. How are we doing, you might ask? How are we doing? Is the carbon price where it should be, or is it lower or higher? The answer to that question is that the world carbon price is nowhere near where anyone thinks it ought to be. It's maybe 1/10 of the most modest estimate of the social cost of carbon. The actual global carbon price is essentially zero. And I'm not going to go through the various proofs of that, but I want to talk about why that's a problem and what we might do about it in the file. So as I think about this, the problem here is that these treaties have been ineffective in limiting carbon emissions. I'll show you one graph here, which is the trend in global emissions from 1970 to 2017. Policies have been really ineffective in dealing with climate change, and the reason is because of free riding. And free riding is where you receive the benefit of collective activity, collective action, without paying the cost, without contributing. And in the case of international climate policy, what it means is you get the reduction in damages due to people's efforts, but you don't have to do any costly steps at home. And so I'll just talk, that's the free rider problem in economics, in climate change. So in research on this issue and following brilliant studies of the economics of treaties and game theory, I came to a solution that I called a climate club, and want to talk about that in my last 3 minutes. So what is the idea of a climate club? The idea is that nations can overcome the syndrome of free riding in international agreements if they adopt the model of a club. And a club is an agreement where you know what clubs are. We're all in clubs of various kinds. But there are also international clubs. There's the club of the EU, to which you remember. There's the club of NATO, which you're not a member, but Sweden is not a member, but is a beneficiary. There's the club of the World Trade Organization, of which we are all beneficiaries. And the idea for club here is to change the way we think of international agreements, which are essentially voluntary for climate, to make them ones where you not only benefit, but you pay. And for the example that I'll suggest is an international climate club to overcome free riding, is the idea is that you would have club play dues through abatement, but non-members are penalized by having tariffs on their imports into the club region. And so let's say you set a target carbon price of $50 a ton, then nations would have their domestic price through whatever mechanism they would choose at $50 a ton. But if you weren't a participant, then you would have a penalty tariff into the club region. So the dues are abatement, and the penalties are the tariff. And I'll just show you a very simple example. This is from my presidential address to the American Economics Association. And it's a very simple idea here. The bars from left to right are the tariff rates of a club, There are 15 regions in this, and the height of the bar is how many participants there are as a function of each tariff level. And the first tariff level is 0, and that's the basic structure where there's no penalty to non-participation and there are no participants. But in this simple example for a $50 a ton, as the tariff rates gets up to 2, 3, 4, 5%, you see more and more nations participate. And then if high enough, all nations participate. So we're obviously a long way from the Climate Club or analogous arrangements, but I think that we should look at this as a kind of model for future going forward. So I think I'll just wrap up here, and I'll just make 4 points to end up where we need to go next. First, we need to accept and understand the gravity of climate change. Scientists must continue their research, and citizens must reject politicians who spread false and tendentious reasoning. That's a very important step. We must establish policies that raise the price of CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions. We must act locally and nationally, but actions must also be coordinated on a global level. And that's it. And it's clear that finally that we need rapid technological change in the energy sector for the transition. So this concludes my discussion of the economics challenges posed by climate change. And I would emphasize the solution ultimately lies in harnessing human ingenuity to develop and deploy low carbon technologies. And with that thought, I'd like to turn to the extraordinary insights on the economics of technological change that have been developed by my fellow laureate, Paul Romer. So listen up. Thank you.
Before we get back to Paul Romer, Paul, you're there. Let me pick up just briefly on the Sweden-Norway. So in the spirit of brotherly love, as we call it, and in the spirit of Alfred Nobel, actually, I would like this game to end 1-1, so we need to award Sweden another point, and I've chosen to give it for producing less fossil fuel than Norway. But Paul Romer was born in 1955 in Denver, Colorado. He received his PhD from University of Chicago, but unlike Professor Nordhaus, Paul moved around quite a bit. University of Rochester, back to University of Chicago, University of California at Berkeley, Stanford University, New York University, where you are currently. The research question there, as we already know now, was about this other resource, knowledge. And in particular, knowledge, how it's advanced in market economies. Not at universities. Obviously, it's advanced here as well, but in market economies. And I said that knowledge accumulation in the form of new technologies is absolutely crucial for us. And we've heard it's crucial in this particular area as well. So the key step here was the development of what is now ubiquitously called endogenous growth theory. Please, ladies and gentlemen, Paul Romer.
I too will rely on technology, and as a designated advocate for technology, you can count on it failing me at some point during the talk. So thank you, Per, for framing the work that Bill and I have been engaged in such, I think, an appropriate way. It really is the global macroeconomics of the tension between the restraining force of scarce resources and the positive force that can come from discovery and innovation. Let me ask you to thank all the members of the committee for highlighting the connection between these two forces, the restraining and the positive, and it's the balance of these two that will determine our fate. Thanks as well to the many friends and colleagues and to the members of my family who can all be here today. Let me save my appreciation for the vision of Alfred Nobel and for the foundation that continues to keep his vision alive. Let me save that for my conclusion. So lately, lots of people have been asking me why exactly I won the Nobel Prize in Economics. My task, once again, is to try to explain, and I'll do my best. But one of the things I learned from my father, who's here in the front row, who spent his life as a politician, is that the key to success is to manage expectations. So let me warn you that I have trouble explaining why I think technological change is so compelling and so subtle. When my son Jeff was 7 or 8, he asked me what kind of work I did as a professor. I told him, well, I'm trying to understand why your grandparents, when they were children, didn't have access to the kinds of things that you have, like a video cassette recorder. Jeff looked at me and said, Dad, that's obvious. When Nanny and Granddad were kids, the video cassette recorder hadn't been invented yet. Is there anything else from your work that I can help you with? So today, I'll start by trying to describe this notion of the possibility of progress and explain why, when I was in graduate school in 1980, there were so many doubts about whether progress was possible, whether this positive force of discovery could offset the tension, the restraining force of the scarce resources. Then I'll describe the theory I developed to try and show that progress is indeed possible, at least in principle. I'll turn after that to the description of two practical suggestions that emerge from this theory, analogous to Bill's suggestion about the carbon tax, mindful, as I am, that Alfred Nobel stipulated that prize winners be judged on the benefit they confer to humankind, not just on the scientific merit of their discoveries. So when I was in graduate school in 1980, I think there were at least three distinct forces that were undermining confidence about the possibility of progress. One was a growing list of negative side effects from unanticipated negative side effects from what seemed like positive technological discoveries. One of the most interesting was a discovery by Sherland Rowand and Mario Molina that chlorofluorocarbons could be destroying the ozone layer, a discovery for which they received the prize in chemistry in 1995. But their paper on this was in '74, but at this point we had also seen problems with DDT, the damage that was done to human health by leaded gasoline, even the cancer that was caused by cigarettes. So it seemed plausible that that positive force of discovery might not turn out, even on its own, to be so positive because of the unexpected negative side effects. It was also the case in 1980 that people had lost faith in the government to do the very basic jobs that we expected of the government. Throughout the 70s, there had been this steadily increasing rate of inflation. We'd had recessions that caused unemployment and moved inflation down, but still to a relatively high level. So we referred to the new experience is that of stagflation. But the really disturbing fact was that from one recession to the next, the general trend was for a steady increase in the underlying rate of inflation. Now, finally, my undergraduate degree was in physics. And from economic theory, the only theory of growth that made any sense to a physicist was the one developed by Thomas Malthus. It starts from an incontrovertible premise that there's a finite quantity of every natural resource. Using only simple arithmetic, it then follows that there is no possibility of sustained progress. Let me use copper as an example of a natural resource. The total mass of copper on Earth and Earth's crust is finite. Think of measuring that in kilograms. For every person in the Earth, the total number of people, you divide kilograms of copper by people, you get a certain amount of copper per person. Even if we don't use copper up because we transform it, but it still exists, there's no way to increase the total supply of copper available per person that we can use to do things like provide electricity. So there's no possibility of progress if it takes more of something like copper per person to make progress. And if we see a pattern of progress, it's very easy to reconcile that with this scarcity, because it could be a sign that we're depleting the untransformed stock of copper in the Earth's crust. We're depleting that, using more and more per person, but we're soon headed to the wall. We won't be able to keep extracting more and more copper. And when we hit that wall, it was equally plausible that we might not just slow down, but we could really face a collapse. Now, I was focused primarily on the trend. I was looking at history and saw this progress over 10,000 years that seemed hard to justify as just a temporary phenomenon that would soon come to the end. But the Malthusian theory has another implication, not about the trend, but about what economists refer to as a scale effect. What's the effect of having more people? Say at a point in time, suppose you have twice as many people. Here too, the conclusion is very grim. Twice as many people means half as much copper per person. It's just arithmetic. Now, Homo sapiens emerged during the Pleistocene in an era when this Malthusian theory applied with full force. And key elements of human nature were shaped by this experience. The one I want to emphasize is the predisposition we have to group people into us and them. Them is a group that poses an existential threat to us. They might steal our resources. They're also an opportunity. We might be able to steal their resources from them. And even if all we do is share, there's less for us when there's more of them. Now, Donna Strickland, who was one of this year's prize recipients in physics, told me that when she was president of the Optical Society, she was part of the planning for the International Year of Light. One of the goals they emphasized was the eradication of light poverty. Now, this is a picture that I've never forgotten since I saw it more than a decade ago. What it shows is some students studying under streetlights outside the airport in Conakry, Guinea. Now, this conveys just instantly that the human consequences of light poverty. They can't do their homework at home. It also suggests this obvious fact about technology. We know how to provide light in homes. Why don't we use that technology to provide light in the homes of these students? But there's an emotion that can be invoked by this picture, which also relates to this Malthusian fear about us and them. With existing technology, if we were to provide them the same access to electricity that we have, this would lead to more emissions of carbon and could threaten the planet. So, although it's not always voiced, there is a realistic perception, seemingly realistic perception, that we have to retreat to a notion of us and them. We can't let them have what we have because we'll destroy the planet. Now, the problem as I saw it in my development of this theory of the economics of ideas was not what Malthusian theory suggested about scarce objects, but it was what it omitted, which was this possibility of discovering new ideas. This had been referred to, the process of the accumulation of ideas was often referred to as technological change, and just like my son Jeff, my colleagues recognized that this could be the offsetting force. But to have a theory that could satisfy a physicist, I needed to dig down into what was the meaning of an idea. How could we be precise about an idea and then use the accumulation of ideas as a way to understand technological progress? Now, one of the key elements of an idea is that it represents codified knowledge. It's knowledge represented in symbols on a piece of paper or in bits these days. Because it's codified, it can be copied and shared and then used by everybody on Earth. And by shared, I don't mean the kind of sharing where we take turns. This is the sharing where everybody can use something like the Pythagorean theorem at the same time, if we want to, for example, create the kinds of right angles that we use in construction. Now, the best way I know to illustrate a single idea comes from a truly remarkable paper that my co-recipient, Bill, wrote in the 1990s. His insight was that we could measure progress by using not the conventional units of $1's worth of purchasing power today or €1's worth of purchasing power. We could measure output per person in the kind of units that a physicist would recognize, Lumen Hours. Now, think of a lumen as the light that's produced by a candle. And going all the way back to the Pleistocene, Bill measured the amount of light that the average person could get from an hour of work. There's no way for me to improve on his words from this paper. I have performed a number of experiments with sesame oil and lamps purportedly dating from Roman times. See the appendix. These experiments provide evidence that an hour's work today will buy 350,000 times as much illumination as could be bought in early Babylonia. That's real progress. And when you look at the pattern of progress, most of it comes in the very recent period, the period since the Industrial Revolution and since the scientific revolution. Now, in this paper, there's one data point which represents the roughly tenfold increase in the amount of light that we could extract from a gas flame that was the result of burning that flame inside what was called a mantle. Now, my reaction to that was, what in the world is a mantle? And what's the physics behind the process whereby it coaxes 10 times as much light out of a gas flame? This picture illustrates the difference between an open gas flame and a mantle. And it's hard to see, but if you look at a physical mantle, what you notice is that it's a metal cage. And burning the flame inside the cage heats up the metal to the point of incandescence, which means that the metal glows with this bright white light that you see in the picture. Now, the man who discovered this, Welsbach, could take that insight and then put it to use in streetlights all over the world, long before Edison discovered how to make a wire incandescent by running electricity through it. But Welsbach could share this idea with everybody in the world who had access to a gas streetlight because it was codified knowledge, which could then be spread and was copied all throughout the world. Now, there's another concept that I need to flesh out about related to ideas, which is what computer scientists refer to as combinatorial explosion. If you have a number of elements that you can combine, you have 10 elements and combine them, we can calculate how many combinations can you make. If you have 20, we can calculate again. Combinatorial explosion is a summary of the fact that the number of combinations explodes as you take more and more raw different elements that you can use to combine them. So when, for example, we think about all the possible peptides you can make out of amino acids, there's this immense, just unbelievably large set of peptides that are, peptides that you can create out of 50 amino acid or amino acid units. And this year's chemistry prize is about methods for creating libraries of all of these peptides and exploring them using new kind of methods, including those motivated by evolution. When Welsbach was trying to find the right mix of metals for his mantle, he tried a number of different metals and mixtures. And again, the number of possible mixtures explodes as you think of more and more metals. So an idea is codified knowledge about the properties of one from an almost infinite set of possibilities. And when you define an idea that way, it's immediately obvious that the discovery of new ideas from these almost infinite sets of possibilities could offset the scarce resources implied by the Malthusian analysis. So, to understand the difference this makes, look again at this picture. If more light gives these students the chance to study, to go work in science, they may discover something like the mantle, and they may provide a benefit to us that could more than offset the costs of additional mitigation of, or avoidance of carbon emissions. So ideas mean that people are no longer our rivals. They can be our allies. And this suggests a very important possibility that we can take the set of us and expand it. We can draw a bigger circle, include more people inside us, and treat them with at least the indifference or the small appreciation that comes from membership in the set of us. Now, this benefit of other people was a possibility that Bill discovered in a model he published in 1969. Canero, another Nobel Prize winning economist, wrote a model with that same property in 1962. In the 90s, after working out a theory of growth based on ideas, and along with other economists, worked on results showing that integrating different regions of the world into a unified global system where we traded goods, but particularly importantly, we traded ideas. This could speed up the worldwide rate of growth. But in a conversation I had with Bill, he said that he was uncomfortable about this result, that more people could actually be beneficial, because it was a theoretical possibility, but how did we know it was true? And when I looked at combining different regions, letting them work with each other, I skirted this issue because, in effect, what I was saying is we can let more people come to this party, but they got to bring their own resources. So there wasn't the same effect of more people meant less natural resources for each of us. What was astonishing was that work that emerged around this time, including work by Chad Jones, who's here somewhere, but also Ron Lee from demography, Michael Creamer, another young economist, work showing that from the period of roughly the Neolithic revolution to at least the scientific revolution, the actual evolution of humans as a species was driven by a process of more discoveries leading to the production of more food, which led to more people who in turn developed more and more discoveries. And so there was this explosive process of growth that was in the population that was proceeding at a rate that was growing exponentially. So this is not exponential growth. This is exponential growth in the rate of exponential growth, which is the best way to characterize the behavior of humans up through about the Industrial Revolution. And as Michael Creamer showed, and as was also implicit in analysis by Diamond in his book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, the evolution of at least the carrying capacity of the number of people varied across regions that had started from initial differences in stocks of people and differences in the initial intrinsic carrying capacity. So some regions could take off in terms of technology and then have this more rapid growth of people and more growth of technology. Others, like Australia, after the ice had melted and there was no longer a land bridge that connected them to other people, where technological progress was very limited. But notice, this is an unusual notion of progress. It's progress in carrying capacity, but it's not progress in standards of living, because for most of this period, as we got more and more capacity for producing food, what it led to was more and more people. So rapidly growing people, rapidly growing technology, and increases in carrying capacity, but not much improvement in standards of living. And it's really after the Industrial Revolution, at about the same time as we started to limit our own fertility and the growth of the population, that we see what I would call material progress, which is growth in standards of living, growth in how much we have, like how much light we can have. Now, the key point I want to make is that there's a third notion of progress, what I want to call human progress. Progress not in what we have, but in who we are. And it's the kind of progress that comes from seeing other people, even perhaps starting to see other sentient beings, like the animals we interact with, seeing them as part of us, treating them with at least indifference rather than malevolence, and treating them as objects of predation. This type of progress in who we are is even more important than the material progress. And I know that the moral reasoning suggests that we should be capable of that kind of moral progress, human progress, even if in some sense it works to our disadvantage. But let's be honest, people are people. It's a lot easier to get people to think of others as allies if in fact those others actually help them. And this is what the period of explosive population growth shows. On balance, it's better to have more people. They are our allies. They are part of us. Now, am I being Pollyanna-ish? It's something I get accused of in saying that we're capable of this kind of deep human progress. I don't think so. For example, we live in cities with millions of people, most of whom are strangers, and we're not threatened by them, and we don't try to attack them. And this is something that our ancestors in the Pleistocene could never have understood. But even more importantly, us used to mean the way that men thought about other men. And we're in the process of a fundamental change in our human nature and make a fundamental improvement along the lines of human progress, because we now recognize that women belong as full members of us. We're a long way from full equality in terms of respect and dignity, But the direction is unambiguous. We've made some progress on this dimension, and the direction is unambiguous. And again, this shouldn't have required any personal benefit. It shouldn't have required self-interest to demand this kind of human progress. But again, it helps when people understand that the discoveries of Marie Curie or Donna Strickland or Francis Arnold can actually make our lives better, and that there's a huge advantage in doubling the number of people who can contribute to the production of the ideas from which we all benefit. So my time is coming to an end. Let me just hint at two practical policy applications that emerge from this economics of ideas. One is to think of cities as chances for people, especially in the developing world, to get the benefits of interaction with other people. Other people are beneficial on net. In the words of my colleague Ed Glazer, cities make us smarter. Now, in the coming century, we will build more urban area than we've built. We humans will build more human area than we've built since the Neolithic Revolution. It'll take only about 100 years. And then as the population stabilizes in this century, this project, what my colleague Sully Angel calls the urbanization project, will be done. We'll have the layouts of the cities that people will live with forever. And if we lay out the city from the beginning, if a government lays out the city with a plan that protects some public space, that allows the kind of connectivity you get when you've got a street that's wide enough for a bus to drive down, and to make sure that nobody's more than about a half a kilometer from a bus route that they could use from home to work. If you lay out that space in advance, it costs almost nothing. If you try to get it after completely disorganized, unplanned development, it's almost infinitely costly to get that space. I don't think we'll ever see anywhere in the future the kind of experience that Paris went through under Haussmann, where it was possible to just destroy large numbers of buildings, move people, and build broad avenues where they didn't exist before. So we have a chance in the next 100 years, at very low cost, to lay the foundation for successful urbanization that can help everyone enjoy the benefits of learning from others. But if we take a pass on this, the opportunity will be gone, and the entire future will be less, will generate less material progress for all the people who could so much benefit from it. The other point I need to make is that because the population won't grow after this century, to keep getting more and more ideas, we need more people to go into science, and we need to raise the productivity in science. One of the interesting things that I looked at in the data about Nobel Prize winners is in the 1900s, the first decade and the second decade of the 20th century, something like 6%, only 6% of the recipients were from the United States. No, I think even 3% in the first 20 years. Then, and from the 1930s and 40s, it increases to 15%. After World War II, it approaches more than 50%. That early development is a sign of investments the United States made in a university system that started in the 1860s. And it takes time for a commitment to science to progress to the point where you have people doing Nobel Prize quality science. But it's possible. And we could do now new things that help spur the same kind of both increase in the total fraction of the population that is engaged in discovery and research and science, and we can raise the productivity of all of those people. There is evidence right now that productivity in science has been falling as more and more people have gone into it, but this is something that we can correct. Finally, it is true that we face a very serious challenge with addressing global warming. But it's important to remember this is a challenge not of the physics, not of nature, not of scarce resources. This is a challenge of making a decision. It's like deciding to switch to daylight savings. It's like deciding in Sweden to shift to driving on the right. It's not hard to do it once you decide. What's hard is deciding. And that's what Bill's idea of the club is about. But even within a country, we need to find ways to appeal to other parts of the human spirit to persuade us all to make those kinds of decisions. So let me close with encouragement to young people about what a fantastic life can come from science, and encouragement to young economists. At a time when the economics profession has gotten a lot more competitive, it's much tougher to start out as a young person than it was when I was a graduate student or Bill was. But remember that there is an enormous opportunity in economics to start to explore these broader notions of progress, the broader side of human nature that includes the kind of things that William Faulkner talked about in his Nobel speech: love and honor, pity and pride, and compassion and sacrifice. Economics will be much more relevant when we can take account of all those, and we'll have a better idea about why is it that we can sometimes appeal to sacrifice and people respond, because this is what we'll need. So let me close by expressing my deep appreciation for the system of prizes that Alfred Nobel established and that the Nobel Foundation has sustained, a system for celebrating all the types of intellectual inquiry that emerged from the period we call the Enlightenment. And remember, there's a reason we call it the Enlightenment. So yes, let there be light. Let there be light in daily life. But let there be light, too, in our spirits and our souls. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Yes, we will. I guess you can shake hands or something.